Has anyone else noticed how Arsenal have just got much bigger over the summer? What do I mean by that? Well, let's take a look at the starting 11 from the Community Shield that Arsenal put out against Manchester City, and there's a few things to notice here. The first one is that Arsenal are playing a back line of entirely centre-backs. They brought in Jurrien Timber from Ajax. He played as a centre-back last year. Ben White has been playing as a right-back for Arsenal for a few seasons, but he's also played as a centre-back at Brighton and Leeds as well. And so what we're seeing here is something that we've seen from Pep Guardiola, that is playing a lot of centre-backs in your back line. Another thing to notice is that Mikel Arteta went with Thomas Partey and Declan Rice alongside Martin Ødegaard in that midfield. Now, as we know, Thomas Partey has been playing as a 6 for Arsenal for a few seasons now. Declan Rice, signed from West Ham, has been playing as part of a 2-man midfield. This is a very physically imposing midfield for Arsenal. And then finally, we have Kai Havertz, signed from Chelsea this summer, playing as a 9 in this game, but offering a very different physical profile to the usual number 9s that Arsenal have been playing in, Gabriel Jesus or Eddie Nketiah. He's a bit more of a taller player. He's going to win balls in the air more often as well. And so what we're seeing here is actually quite a physically imposing Arsenal team. And so the big question becomes, why is it that Arteta has made Arsenal physically bigger this summer? And in order to answer that question, we need to have a little think about tactics. Now, the important thing to note about Mikel Arteta is that, like many other elite coaches, he likes his teams to impose themselves on every phase of play. Now, that's easy to do when you're playing teams that are worse than you, because in those games you're probably going to be dominating the ball, and it's much easier to impose yourselves in those sorts of situations. But there have been some games under Mikel Arteta where Arsenal have struggled to impose themselves. For example, before this year's Community Shield, Arsenal had lost 8 straight times to Manchester City. And in these games, Arsenal are generally going to have less possession, and that means it's harder to impose yourself on the game. And so that brings us to the question of how you impose yourself on games out of possession. Now, some teams out of possession are fairly happy to allow the opponents to just build the ball up around the back, move the ball down the field up into a point where they're around the halfway line, at which point then they will start engaging in defensive actions. That's a nice way of approaching the game because it allows you to be fairly structured out of possession. You're not giving away too much space in behind, so you're going to make the opposition work really hard to actually break you down to score. But there are some downsides. For example, if you're not engaging the opponents until the halfway line, you're just allowing them to dictate the play up until that point, and you're giving them a huge amount of possession of the ball. And also there is the risk that they can force your defensive block deeper and deeper and deeper, and all you're doing the whole time then is defending. You're not able to impose yourself on the game in possession at all. Now, Mikel Arteta doesn't want to do that because he wants to disrupt the opponent's build-up much earlier. So what we'll see from Arsenal a lot of the time in these out of possession phases is them pushing really high up the field, often going player for player across the field to try and make it really hard for the opponents to build out. But there are downsides to this approach as well. For example, by pushing up high, you're leaving a load of space in behind the defense that can be unlocked through just one pass. That's quite a dangerous way of playing. But there's another downside here, and that is that despite the fact that going player for player can be really good to disrupt the opposition, it can also leave yourself exposed as well. So in this situation, let's imagine that Arsenal end up going player for player. The centre-back pushes up here. Now, if we look along that back line, we can see that there's 4 situations where Arsenal players are in 1v1 matchups against their opponent. And so all it takes is for the opponent then to target one of these 1v1 matchups. They're probably going to go for the one with the weakest player of the opponent in, and then you're just one pass again away from being in a dangerous situation that can result in a goal scoring opportunity. And so rather than being constantly vulnerable to these sorts of turnovers, getting in behind, Mikel Arteta wants to have the best of both worlds. In certain phases, you're going to have his team pushing up player for player in high areas to disrupt the opposition, but if the press is broken or if there's any threat of a ball in behind, what you'll then see is Arsenal dropping out into a more zonal, conservative block. So Arsenal are able to impose themselves out of possession at both ends of the pitch. So how did this play out in the Community Shield? Well, let's imagine here that Manchester City have a goal kick. Arsenal are pushing up high. They want to jump player for player in certain situations, and so they're really nicely structured for this moment. Now, there's a few things to notice here. The first thing is that Arsenal are blocking out the middle of the field. They don't want to give Manchester City any space at all to build up through the middle, because when they do that, they're really dangerous. So we have a lot of players in the central areas. Both of the wide players are actually quite narrow here. So what they're doing here is allowing Manchester City space in the wide areas, blocking out the middle. The other thing to notice is that Arsenal are really going to try and force Manchester City to build up on this side of the field, because this is the side of the field with Diaz and Akanji on it, rather than John Stones and Kyle Walker, much better in the build-up phase. And the way that they're going to do this is by using Kai Havertz to give him a bended run here. So what he can do is he can actually close the line between Ortega and Stones, that's going to force the ball into this part of the pitch. The natural pass then becomes the pass to Ruben Dias here. Once they force the ball onto this side of the pitch, what Arsenal are going to try and do then is go player for player to make it really hard for Manchester City to build up. And actually, if we look at the structure that Arsenal have, you can see all of their players are at pretty good distances to their counterparts. So Saka is on Akanji, we've got White and Grealish, we've got Saliba on Haaland, but we've also got Partey doubling up on Haaland because he is their most dangerous aerial threat. And then across the pitch, we can just see player for player all the way around the field, just making it really hard for Manchester City to build up. Now, there is obviously a weakness here because Ødegaard is responsible for marking two players, and in this situation, what he would be expected to do is to push up onto Dias to put him under pressure. Now, obviously, this does leave Kovacic free in the middle, but Arsenal have a really smart way of being able to deal with that. And this is where Declan Rice and Thomas Partey come in because they play a really important role in this system, a role that I like to call the in-between role. So we've got Declan Rice here, he's responsible for tracking Rodri usually, but he also has the ability to come across to Kovacic if Ødegaard pushes forward onto Dias. Now, there will be some situations where Rice won't be able to leave Rodri because he's a passing option, and in those situations what you'll see is Thomas Partey pushing up onto Kovacic to make sure there's no free player. But again, what we notice is that this leaves Arsenal in a situation where they've got 1v1s all the way across the back line. And in those situations, Arsenal are vulnerable to the balls in behind, particularly when you have 1v1 matchups involving Erling Haaland. But there is another potential problem here, and that is that Man City simply play around the Arsenal press. And if they can do that well enough, they could get their midfielders in these open spaces running at the opposition back line with the opportunity of playing all of these through balls through to these four players. And it's these situations where Arsenal have to work really hard to get back into their low block, like this, with all of their players falling in, hoping to get into a situation where they can stop this happening before Manchester City can get a good chance away. Let's have a look at a couple of examples from the game. So here we can see Manchester City with the goalkeeper on the ball. Here's Kai Havertz, he's going to make that curving run to force the ball onto this side. We've got Declan Rice playing as a between player between the Manchester City pivots, and then we have Ødegaard here as well, ready to jump up onto Dias if the ball is passed in that direction. The ball is passed in that direction because that's the way that Arsenal want it to go. It goes to Dias, and as we can see already, Ødegaard is pushing out to Dias to go play for player. Declan Rice is moving across to Kovacic to make sure he's not free, and as you can see, he's pointing back at Rodri, showing you now that there is a spare man in that midfield. Now, because of the speed of this jump from Ødegaard onto Dias, Dias actually ends up playing the ball back to Ortega, and we end up in this situation, which is exactly the same structural thing. Ødegaard's going to drop back. We can see Declan Rice coming across onto Rodri. We can see Havertz pointing out the free man again, just making sure that that pass isn't played. So this is the structure of the high press. But what happens when the high press is broken? Well, here we've got a situation where Ortega is able to find Dias in space because Kovacic has pulled Ødegaard across, and this opens a huge amount of space up in the wide area here. Dias sees that space and runs into it, and as we can see, all of the Arsenal players are dropping back, apart from Saka, who's going to step up to Dias to slow him down to help his teammates get into the defensive structure. And here is that defensive structure. We can see that 4-4-2 shape there, really nice and compact, not allowing any space to Manchester City. And as we can see from the breaking of that high press, Arsenal have managed to get back into their low block without allowing a good chance. But that's not to say that Manchester City didn't ever expose Arsenal's pressing, so I've got a really nice example of that here. Now, this is an interesting situation because Arsenal are between the high press phase and the lower block phase, and because of this, Manchester City are able to exploit the indecision that Arsenal are in. So in this situation, we've got John Stones on the ball, he's pulling Kai Havertz forward. If he does that, he's leaving Rodri free, and that means that Declan Rice has to jump up. Again, you can see him pointing, recognizing that this player is going to be free. At the same time, John Stones is also threatening the pass across to Dias, and if that happens, as we know, Ødegaard has to jump up onto Dias. That means he's leaving his player free, and then Thomas Partey will have to jump up on him as well. But there is one Manchester City player who recognises the problems that Arsenal are going to face with Thomas Partey stepping up, and that is Erling Haaland, who is now in a 1v1 battle with William Saliba. And as you can see on the very edge of this screenshot, you can see Haaland recognising that he can attack the space in behind. He invites the long ball through from John Stones and actually ends up in a really nice 1v1 situation against William Saliba. Actually has a really good chance of getting a shot away, but William Saliba's brilliant defending allows him to get a foot in and stop this being exploited any further. Why is all of this interesting? Well, because we've seen it all before. We actually saw Arsenal play this way against Manchester City in their most recent game before the Community Shield. Now, they won the Community Shield on penalties, but the previous game, they played the same defensive structure and they lost 4-1, so something has changed. But let's take a look at that night. So here's Arsenal in the high pressing phase, and as you can see, the basic structure is still the same. We have a forward here, he's going to try and close the passing lane between the two centre-backs. Here we have Granit Xhaka playing the in-between role between the two pivot players of Manchester City, and then here's Ødegaard ready to jump up onto the centre-back when the ball arrives. Again, because Ødegaard jumps forward, the ball ends up going back across the field to Ederson, and as you can see, Arsenal are now pressing aggressively up onto this side of the pitch. The ball's going to arrive at the feet of John Stones, and Arsenal have him under a huge amount of pressure here. Now, Arsenal are actually pressing a lot more aggressively here than they did in the Community Shield. That's maybe something that they've learned from it, but it is still the same sort of principle. Force the ball wide, go player for player, and make it hard for the opposition to build up. The only option that John Stones has here is to go long. He goes long, and the ball ends up at the feet of none other than Erling Haaland, who is now being tracked by Rob Holding here. Man City now have 3 players up against 4 players of Arsenal, but they're able to utilise the speed. Haaland plays the ball into the feet of Kevin De Bruyne, comes across the pitch, gets around the defenders and scores a fantastic goal from outside of the box. And with only 6 minutes gone in the game, Manchester City are able to exploit a weakness in the Arsenal pressing structure. And so the question is, what has changed in the few months between Arsenal losing 4-1 and then them coming out, drawing against Manchester City in the Community Shield and then winning on penalties? And the answer to that question is personnel. And there are 4 players in particular that we need to focus on. So we have Gabriel Jesus playing as the 9, we have Granit Xhaka playing as one of the 8s, Rob Holding has come in as a centre-back, and then we have Zinchenko as a left-back. So that was Arsenal last season. Since then, we've seen them sign some new players who featured in the Community Shield. So instead of Gabriel Jesus, who was injured, we saw Kai Havertz playing as the number 9 rather than Granit Xhaka. We saw Arsenal's record signing Declan Rice coming in as an 8 into this sort of position. Zinchenko was replaced by Jurrien Timber here, and then William Saliba is back, and so he replaces Rob Holding in the centre-back position. And this gives the Arsenal team a completely different physical profile. So we've now got Kai Havertz, who's a much more imposing centre-forward than some of the other options. He's taller than Gabriel Jesus, he's taller than Eddie Nketiah, he's able to do a lot more of that hold-up stuff. And then Declan Rice is a cheat code in terms of what he offers Arsenal out of possession. Not only is he a physical specimen, but he's mobile and intelligent enough to be able to play this in-between position. He played it really well in the Community Shield, and part of the reason why Manchester City struggled so much is because Rice is so good in those sorts of areas. But also Rice offers a lot in terms of that lower block as well. When you have a midfield duo of Partey and Rice in your lower block, you're going to be able to stop anyone coming through the middle. And obviously William Saliba is much better than Rob Holding, and he's going to offer a huge amount more in these 1v1 matchups against players like Erling Haaland, and we've already seen it from the clips that in the situation where Rob Holding was up against Erling Haaland, it resulted in a goal. When William Saliba was 1v1 against Haaland, he was able to stop him. But Jurrien Timber as well offers a very different kind of profile to someone like Zinchenko. So obviously Zinchenko is able to invert, but sometimes he can be a little bit defensively deficient in these wide areas. So if you're playing against a team like Manchester City, he's just going to add a little bit more solidity in these wide areas if you end up in these 1v1 matchups. And so what we're seeing here is that by recruiting more physically imposing players, Mikel Arteta is actually making Arsenal able to compete in these games against elite sides. But it's not just Arsenal's out-of-possession profile that's changed this summer. By making them bigger, Mikel Arteta has also changed aspects of their in-possession profile as well. Obviously, Arteta wants Arsenal to be a possession-based side, so what they're going to try and do is build up, move the ball through the thirds and generate dangerous goal-scoring chances. But when you're playing against a team like Manchester City, they're going to try and make it hard to do that. They are also going to be pressing high, going player for player and disrupting your build-up. And so there's going to be certain situations where Arsenal can actually try and exploit the same sort of weaknesses that Manchester City are trying to exploit in them. That is playing the ball long and winning these 1v1 duels, maybe winning first and second balls in order to retain possession further up the field in more dangerous situations. And that's where this new profile of player comes in, because now you have Kai Havertz, who's able to play a more physically imposing game as a centre forward. You also have Declan Rice, who can engage in winning second balls as well. He's a really good attacking defensive player as well, winning those balls in turnover situations. And because of this, you can then use your goalkeeper maybe to go long in situations where you're under pressure to try and exploit the opposition in certain situations. Here's a nice example of that. Arsenal are about to take a goal kick. Here's the Arsenal pivot players. Now you'd expect them to build up around the back, and so you want your pivot players there to help out. But at some point, Declan Rice realises that Aaron Ramsdale is going to go long, and because of that, he quickly moves himself forward so that he's going to be able to compete for second balls. The ball goes long, Kai Havertz is able to win it, ball bounces up into the air, and lo and behold, Here you've got Declan Rice competing with Bernardo Silva for that second ball. He actually wins a foul in this situation. But what we're seeing here is that Arsenal don't just simply need to build up from the back, they can also go long, compete for first and second balls, and impose themselves much more physically in games like this against teams like Manchester City. So why is Mikel Arteta making Arsenal bigger this season? Well, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? Because he wants his teams to be more competitive against the elite sides in the top competitions. We've already seen him get a result against Manchester City, but he's also going into the Champions League where they will come up against a lot of other elite sides as well. So by making them bigger, Arsenal are now going to be much more competitive going forward.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including journalists dedicated to each Premier League team, so every fan gets the coverage they deserve, not just the big clubs. And you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.